Words for the Wise by T.S. Arthur. The Poor Debtor. There is one honest man in the world, I am happy to say, remarked a rich merchant named Patron to a friend who happened to call in upon him. Is there indeed? I am glad to find you have made a discovery of the fact. Who is the individual entitled to the honorable distinction? You know Moale the tailor? Yes. Poor fellow, he's been under the weather for a long time. I know, but he's an honest man for all that. I never doubted his being honest, Mr. Patron. I have reason to know that he is, but I once thought differently. When he was broken up in business some years ago, he owed me a little bill, which I tried to get out of him as hard as anyone ever did try for his own. But I dunned and dunned him until weary, and then, giving him up as a bad case, passed the trifle that he owed me to account of profit and loss. He has crossed my path a few times since, but as I didn't feel toward him as I could wish to feel toward all men, I treated him with marked coldness. I am sorry for having done so, for it now appears that I judged him too severely. This morning he called in of his own free will, and paid me down the old account. He didn't say anything about interest, nor did I, though I am entitled to and ought to have received it. But as long as he came forward of his own accord and settled his bill, after I had given up all hope of ever receiving it, I thought I might afford to be a little generous and not say anything about the interest, and so I gave him a receipt in full. Didn't I do right? In what respect? Asked the friend. In forgiving him the interest, which I might have claimed as well as not, and which he would, no doubt, have paid down, or brought me at some future time. Oh, yes, you were right to forgive the interest, returned the friend, but in a tone and with a manner that struck the merchant as rather singular. No man should ever take interest on money due from an unfortunate debtor. Indeed, why not? Mr. Patron looked surprised. Is not money always worth its interest? So it is said, but the poor debtor has no money upon which to make an interest. He begins the world again with nothing but his ability to work, and if saddled with an old debt, principal and interest, his case is hopeless. Suppose he owes $10,000, and after struggling hard for 3 or 4 years, gets into a position that will enable him to pay off $1,000 a year. There is some chance for him to get out of debt in 10 years. But suppose interest has been accumulating at the rate of some $600 a year. His debt, instead of being $10,000, will have increased to over $12,000 by the time he is in a condition to begin to pay off anything. And then, instead of being able to reduce the amount $1,000 a year, he will have to let $600 go for the annual interest on the original debt. 4 years would have to elapse before, under this system, he would get his debt down to where it was when he was broken up in business. Thus, at the end of 8 years' hard struggling, he would not really have advanced a step out of his difficulties. A debt of $10,000 would still be hanging over him, and if, persevering to the end, he should go on paying the interest regularly and reducing the principal, some 25 years of his life would be spent in getting free from debt, when little over half that time would have been required if his creditors had, acting from the commonest dictates of humanity, voluntarily released the interest. That is a new view of the case, I must confess. At least new to me, said Mr. Patron. It is the humane view of the case, but looking to interest alone, it is the best view for every creditor to take. Many a man who, with a little effort, might have cancelled in time the principal of a debt unfortunately standing against him, becomes disheartened at seeing it daily growing larger through the accumulation of interest, and gives up in despair. The desire to be free from debt spurs many a man into effort, but makes the difficulties in his way so large as to appear insurmountable, and he will fold his hands in helpless inactivity. Thousands of dollars are lost every year in consequence of creditors grasping after too much and breaking down the hope and energy of the debtors." "Perhaps you are right," said Mr. Patron. "That view of the case never presented itself to my mind. I don't suppose, however, the interest on $50 would have broken down Moale. There is no telling. It is the last pound, you know, that breaks the camel's back. 5 years have passed since the day of his misfortune. $15 of interest are therefore due. I have my doubts if he could have paid you $65 now. Indeed, I am sure he could not. And the thought of that as a new debt, for which he had received no benefit whatever, would, it is more than probable, have produced a discouraged state of mind and made him resolve not to pay you anything at all." "But that wouldn't have been honest," said the merchant. "Perhaps not, strictly speaking. To be dishonest is, from a set purpose, to defraud, to take from another what belongs to him, or to withhold from another, when the ability exists to pay, what is justly his due. You would hardly have placed Moale in either of these positions if, from the pressure of the circumstances surrounding him, as a poor man and in debt, he had failed to be as active, industrious, and prudent as he would otherwise have been. We are all apt to require too much of the poor debtor, and to have too little sympathy with him. Let the hope of improving your own condition, which is the mainspring of all your business operations, be taken away, and instead let there be only the desire to pay off old debts through great labor and self-denial, that must continue for years, and imagine how differently you would think and feel from what you do now. Nay, more. Let the debt be owed to those who are worth their thousands and tens of thousands, and who are in the enjoyment of every luxury and comfort they could desire, while you go on paying them what you owe, by over-exertion and the denial to yourself and family of all those little luxuries and recreations which both so much need, and then say how deeply dyed would be that dishonesty which would cause you, in a moment of darker and deeper discouragement than usual, to throw the crushing weight from your shoulders, and resolve to bear it no longer. You must leave a man with some hope in life, if you would keep him active and industrious in his sphere." Mr. Patron said nothing in reply to this, but he looked sober. His friend soon after left. The merchant, as the reader may infer from his own acknowledgment, was one of those men whose tendency to regard only their own interests had become so confirmed a habit that they can see nothing beyond the narrow circle of self. Upon debtors he had never looked with a particle of sympathy, and had, in all cases, exacted his own as rigidly as if his debtor had not been a creature of human wants and feelings. What had just been said, however, awakened a new thought in his mind, and as he reflected upon the subject, he saw that there was some reason in what had been said, and felt ashamed of his allusion to the interest of the tailor's $50 debt. Not long after, a person came into his store, and from some cause mentioned the name of Moale. "He's an honest man, that I am ready to say of him," remarked Mr. Patron. "Honest, but very poor," was replied. "He's doing well now, I believe," said the merchant. "He's managing to keep soul and body together, and hardly that. He's paying off his old debts. I know he is, but I blame him for injuring his health and wronging his family in order to pay a few $100s to men 1,000 times better off in the world than he is. He brought me $20 on an old debt yesterday, but I wouldn't touch it. His misfortunes had long ago canceled the obligation in my eyes. God forbid that with enough to spare I should take the bread out of the mouths of a poor man's children." "Is he so very poor?" asked Mr. Patron, surprised and rebuked at what he heard. "He has a family of 6 children to feed, clothe, and educate, and he has to do it by his unassisted labor. Since he was broken up in business some years ago, he has had great difficulties to contend with, and only by pinching himself and family, and depriving both of nearly every comfort, has he been able to reduce the old claims that have been standing against him. But he has shortened his own life 10 years thereby, and has deprived his children of the benefits of education, except in an extremely limited degree, wrongs that are irreparable. I honor his stern integrity of character, but think that he has carried his ideas of honesty too far. God gave him these children, and they have claims upon him for earthly comforts and blessings to the extent of his ability to provide. His misfortunes he could not prevent, and they were sent as much for the chastisement of those who lost by him as they were for his own. If, subsequently, his greatest exertion was not sufficient to provide more than ordinary comforts for the family still dependent upon him, his first duty was to see that they did not want. If he could not pay his old debts without injury to his health or wrong to his family, he was under no obligation to pay them, for it is clear that no claims upon us are so imperative as to require us to wrong others in order to satisfy them. Here was another new doctrine for the ears of the merchant, doctrine strange as well as new. He did not feel quite so comfortable as before about the recovered debt of $50. The money still lay upon his desk. He had not yet entered it upon his cash book, and he felt now less inclined to do so than ever. The claims of humanity in the abstract pressed themselves upon him for consideration, and he saw that they were not to be lightly thrust aside. In order to pay the $50, which had been long due to the merchant, Mr. Moale had, as alleged, denied himself and family at every point, and overworked himself to a degree seriously injurious to his health, but his heart felt lighter after the sense of obligation was removed. There was little at home, however, to make him feel cheerful. His wife, not feeling able to hire a domestic, was worn down with care and labor of her large family. The children were, as a necessary consequence, neglected both in minds and bodies. Alas, there was no sunshine in the poor man's dwelling. "Well, Alice," said Mr. Moale, as his wife came and stood by the board upon which he sat at work, holding her babe in her arms, "I have paid off another debt, thank heaven." "Whose?" "Patron's. He believed me a rogue and treated me as such. I hope he thinks differently now." "I wish all men were as honest in their intentions as you are." "So do I, Alice. The world would be a much better one than it is, I'm thinking." "And yet, William," said his wife, "I sometimes think we do wrong to sacrifice so much to get out of debt. Our children—" "Alice," spoke up the tailor quickly, "I would almost sell my body into slavery to get free from debt. When I think of what I still owe, I feel as if I would suffocate." "I know how badly you feel about it, William, but your heart is honest, and should not that reflection bear you up?" "What is an honest heart without an honest hand, Alice?" replied the tailor, bending still to his work. "The honest heart is the main thing, William. God looks at that. Man judges only of the action, but God sees the heart and its purposes." "But what is the purpose without the act?" "It is all that is required, where no ability to act is given. William, God does not demand of anyone impossibilities, though man often does," said the tailor bitterly. There was a pause, broken at length by the wife, who said, "And have you really determined to put John and Henry out to trades? They are so young." "I know they are, Alice, too young to leave home, but—" The tailor's voice became unsteady. He broke off in the middle of the sentence. "Necessity requires it to be done," he said, recovering himself, "and it is of no avail to give way to unmanly weakness. But for this old debt, we might have been comfortable enough, and able to keep our children around us until they were of a more fitting age to go from under their parents' roof. Oh, what a curse is debt! There is more yet to pay? Yes, several hundreds of dollars, but if I fail as I have for a year past, I will break down before I get through. Let us think of our family, William. They have the first claim upon us. Those to whom money is owed are better off than we are. They stand in no need of it. But is it not justly due, Alice? Inquired the tailor in a rebuking voice. No more justly due than is food, and raiment, and a home to our children, replied the tailor's wife, with more than her usual decision of tone. God has given us these children, and he will require an account of the souls committed to our charge. Is not a human soul of more importance than dollars? A few years, and it will be out of our power to do our children good. They will grow up and bear forever the marks of neglect and wrong. Alice! Alice, for heaven's sake, do not talk this way, exclaimed the tailor, much disturbed. William, said the wife, I am a mother, and a mother's heart can feel right. Nature tells me that it is wrong for us to thrust our children out before they are old enough to go into the world. Let us keep them home longer. We cannot, and pay off this debt. Then let the debt go unpaid for the present. Those to whom it is owed can receive no harm from waiting, but our children will. Just then a man brought in a letter, and, handing it to the tailor, withdrew. On breaking the seal, Mr. Moale found that it contained $50 and read as follows: Sir, upon reflection, I feel that I ought not to receive from you the money that was due to me when you became unfortunate some years ago. I understand that you have a large family, that your health is not very good, and that you are depriving the one of comforts and injuring the other in endeavoring to pay off your old debts. To cancel these obligations would be all right, nay, your duty, if you could do so without neglecting higher and plainer duties. But you cannot do this, and I cannot receive the money you paid me this morning. Take it back, and let it be expended in making your family more comfortable. I have enough, and more than enough for all my wants, and I will not deprive you of a sum that must be important, while to me it is of little consequence, either as gained or lost. Edward Petrone. The letter dropped from the tailor's hand. He was overcome with emotion. His wife, when she understood its purport, burst into tears. The merchant's sleep was sweeter that night than it had been for some time, and so was the sleep of the poor debtor. The next day Mr. Moale called to see Mr. Petrone, to whom, at the instance of the latter, he gave a full detail of his actual circumstances. The merchant was touched by his story, and prompted by true benevolence to aid him in his struggles. He saw most of the tailor's old creditors, and induced those who had not been paid in full to voluntarily relinquish their claims, and some of those who had received money since the poor man's misfortunes to restore it as belonging of right to his family. There was not one of those creditors who did not feel happier by their act of generosity, and no one can doubt that both the tailor and his family were also happier. John and Henry were not compelled to leave their home until they were older and better prepared to endure the privations that usually attend the boy's first entrance into the world, and help for the mother in her arduous duties could now be afforded. No one doubts that the creditor, whose money is not paid to him, has rights, but too few think of the rights of the poor debtor, who sinks into obscurity and often privations, while his heart is oppressed with a sense of obligations utterly beyond his power to cancel. End of The Poor Debtor. The Sunday Christian. 2 things are required to make a Christian: piety and charity. The first has relation to worship, and in the last all social duties are involved. Of the great importance of charity in the Christian character, some idea may be gained by the point of question asked by an apostle. If you love not your brother whom you have seen, how can you love God whom you have not seen? There is no mistaking the meaning of this. It says in the plainest language, piety without charity is nothing, and yet how many thousands and hundreds of thousands around us expect to get to heaven by Sunday religion alone? Through the week, they reach out their hands for money on the right and on the left, so eager for its attainment that little or no regard is paid to the interest of others. And on Sunday, with a pious face, they attend church and enter into the most holy acts of worship, fondly imagining that they can be saved by mere acts of piety, while no regard for their fellow man is in their hearts. Such a man was Brian Rowley. His religion was of so pure a stamp that it would not bear the world's rough contact, and therefore it was never brought into the world. He left the world to take care of itself when the Sabbath morning broke, and when the Sabbath morning closed, he went back into the world to look after his own interests. Every Sunday he progressed a certain way towards heaven, and then stood still for a week in order that he might take proper care of the dollars and cents. Businessmen who had transactions with Mr. Rowley generally kept their eyes open. If they did not do it at the first operation, they rarely omitted it afterwards, and for sufficient reason. He was sharp at making a bargain, and never felt satisfied unless he obtained some advantage. Men engaged in mercantile pursuits were looked upon as a general thing as ungodly in their lives, and therefore in a certain sense outsiders. To make good bargains out of these was only to fight them with their own weapons, and he was certainly good at such work. In dealing with his brethren of the same faith, he was rather more guarded, and affected a contempt for carnal things that he did not feel. We said that the religion of Mr. Rowley did not go beyond the pious duties of the Sabbath. This must be amended. His piety flowed into certain benevolent operations of the day. He contributed to the support of Indian and foreign missions, and was one of the managers on a tract board. In the affairs of the Ceylonese and South Sea Islanders, he took a warm interest, and could talk eloquently about the heathen. Not far from Mr. Brian Rowley's place of business was the store of a man named Lane, whose character had been cast originally in a different mold. He was not a church-going man, because, as he said, he didn't want to be thought a hypocrite. In this he displayed a weakness. At one time he owned a pew in the same church to which Rowley was attached, and attended church regularly, although he did not attach himself to the church nor receive its ordinances. His pew was near that of Mr. Rowley, and he had a good opportunity for observing the peculiar manner in which the latter performed his devotions. Unfortunately for his good opinion of the pious Sunday worshipper, they were brought into rather close contact during the week in matters of business, when Mr. Lane had opportunities of contrasting his piety and charity. The want of agreement in these two prerequisites of a genuine Christian disgusted Lane, and caused him so much annoyance on Sunday that he finally determined to give up his pew and remain at home. A disposition to carp at professors of religion was manifested from this time. The whole were judged by Rowley as a sample. One dull day, a man named Gregory, a sort of busybody in the neighborhood, came into the store of Mr. Lane and said to him, "What do you think of our friend Rowley? Is he a good Christian?" "He's a pretty fair Sunday Christian," replied Lane. "What is that?" asked the man. "A hypocrite, to use plain language." "That's pretty hard talk," said Gregory. "Do you think so?" "Yes. When you call a man a hypocrite, you make him out, in my opinion, about as bad as he can well be." "Call him a Sunday Christian, then." "A Sunday Christian?" "Yes, that is, A man who puts his religion on every Sabbath, as he does his Sunday coat, and lays it away again carefully on Monday morning, so that it will receive no injury in everyday contact with the world. I believe with you that Rowley doesn't bring much of his religion into his business. No, nor as much common honesty as would save him from perdition. He doesn't expect to be saved by keeping the moral law. There will be a poor chance for him, in my opinion, if he's judged finally by that code. You don't seem to have a very high opinion of our friend Rowley. I own that. I used to go to church, but his pious face was ever before me, and his psalm singing ever in my ears. Was it possible to look at him and not think of his grasping, selfish, overreaching conduct in all his business transactions through the week? No, it was not possible for me, and so, in disgust, I gave up my pew, and haven't been to church since. The next man whom Gregory met, he made the repository of what Lane had said about Rowley. This person happened to be a member of the church, and felt scandalized by the remarks. After a little reflection, he concluded to inform Mr. Rowley of the free manner in which Mr. Lane had spoken of him. "Called me a hypocrite!" exclaimed the indignant Mr. Rowley, as soon as he was advised of the free manner in which Mr. Lane had talked about him. "So I understand. Gregory was my informant." Mr. Gregory was called upon, and confirmed the statement. Rowley was highly indignant, and while the heat of his anger was upon him, called at the store of Mr. Lane, in company with 2 members of his church who were not at all familiar with his business character, and, therefore, held him in pretty high estimation as a man of piety and sincerity. The moment Mr. Lane saw these 3 men entering his place of business, he had a suspicion of their errand. "Can I have some private conversation with you?" asked Mr. Rowley, with a countenance as solemn as the grave. "Certainly," replied Mr. Lane, not the least discomposed. "Walk back to my counting room. We shall be entirely alone there. Do you wish your friends present?" "I do," was gravely replied. "I brought them for that purpose." "Walk back, gentlemen," said Lane, as he turned to lead the way. The 4 men retired to the little office of the merchant in the back part of the store. After they were seated, Lane said, "Well, Mr. Rowley, I am ready to hear what you have to say." Mr. Rowley cleared his throat 2 or 3 times, and then said, in a voice that indicated a good deal of inward disturbance, "I understand that you have been making rather free use of my name of late." "Indeed? In what way?" Lane was perfectly self-possessed. "I am told that you went so far as to call me a hypocrite." The voice of Rowley trembled. "I said you were a Sunday Christian," replied Lane. "What do you mean by that?" was peremptorily demanded. "A man whose religion is a Sunday affair altogether. One who expects to get to heaven by pious observances and church-goings on the Sabbath, without being over-particular as to the morality of his conduct through the week." "Morality? Do you pretend to say that I am an immoral man?" said Rowley with much heat. "Do not get into a passion," returned Lane coolly. "That will not help us at all in this grave matter." Rowley quivered in every nerve, but the presence of his 2 brethren admonished him that a Christian temper was very necessary to be maintained on the occasion. "Do you charge me with want of morality?" he said with less visible excitement. "I do. That is, according to my own code of morality." "Upon what do you base your code?" asked one of the witnesses of this rather strange interview. "On the Bible," replied Lane. "Indeed," was answered with some surprise. "On what part of it?" "On every part, but more particularly that passage in the New Testament where the whole of the law and the prophets is condensed in a single passage enjoining to love our neighbor as well as God." Rowley and his friends looked surprised at this remark. "Explain yourself," said the former, with a knit brow. That is easily done. The precept here given, and it comes from the highest authority, expressly declares, as I understand it, religion to consist in acting justly toward all men, as well as in pious acts towards God. If a man love not his brother, whom he hath seen, how can he love God, whom he hath not seen? Does our brother Rowley deny that? Asked the men present. If a man's life is any index to his faith, I would say that he does, replied Mr. Lane. A deep crimson overspread the face of Mr. Rowley. I didn't expect insult when I came here, said he, in a trembling voice. Nor have I offered any, replied Mr. Lane. You have thought proper to ask me a number of very pointed questions, and I have merely answered them according to my views of truth. You make a very sweeping declaration, said one of the friends of Rowley. Suppose you give some proof of your assertion. That I can readily do, if it is desired. I desire it then, said Rowley. Do you remember the 5 bales of cotton you sold to Peterson? Inquired Mr. Lane. Rowley replied that he did, but evinced some uneasiness of manner at the question. They were damaged, said Lane. I sold them as I bought them, returned Rowley. Did you buy them as damaged? No, I bought the cotton as a good article. And sold it as good? Mr. Rowley seemed a little confused. I sold the cotton at 12 cents a pound, was the reply. Nothing was said about the quality. 12 cents is the price of a prime article. If you had been asked by Peterson if the cotton were in good condition, would you have answered affirmatively? Do you think I would tell a lie? Asked Mr. Rowley indignantly. Our acts are the most perfect expressions of our intentions, replied Mr. Lane. You were deceived in your purchase of the cotton. The article proved so near valueless as not to be really worth 3 cents a pound. You discovered this, as I have the best reasons for knowing, almost as soon as it came into your possession, and yet you offered it to Peterson, who, not suspecting for a moment that anything was wrong, bought it at the regular market rate as good. You saved yourself, but Peterson, though not a professor of religion, was too honest to put his bad bargain off upon another. Now, if that act on your part was loving your neighbor as yourself, I must own to a very perverted understanding of the sacred precept. I, though no church member, would have put my head into the fire rather than do such an act. Mr. Rowley, much confused by so direct a charge, attempted to explain the matter away, alleging that he did not think that the article was so badly damaged, that as he sold he bought, that it wasn't right that he should bear all the loss, with much more to the same purpose, to all of which Lane opposed but little. He had presented the case already strong enough for all to see how far it comported with Christian morality. But he had more to say. Beyond this, which I bring forward as a specimen of the character of your dealings with your fellow men, I could adduce almost innumerable examples of your indirect and covert modes of obtaining the advantage in ordinary transactions. You may not be aware of the fact, Mr. Rowley, but your reputation among businessmen is that of a dealer so close to your own side of the bargain as to trench upon the rights of others. You invariably keep the half-cent in giving change, while you have been repeatedly known to refuse a 10-cent piece and 2 cents for an 11-pence. In fact, you are known as a man who invariably seeks to get the best of every transaction. If this is Christian charity, if this is a just regard for the rights of your neighbors, if this is in agreement with the spirit of the Bible, then I have been laboring under a mental delusion. Man of the world as I am, heathen as you have seemed to regard me, I am proud to say that I govern my actions from a higher principle. You now understand, gentlemen, addressing the friends of Rowley, why I have called this man a Sunday Christian. It is plain that he expects to get to heaven by a simple Sunday service of his Maker, while all the week he pursues gain so eagerly as to thrust other people aside, and even make his way, so to speak, over their prostrate bodies. I have no more to say. Rowley was so much confounded by this unexpected charge that he was silent. His own conscience wrote an affirmation of the truth in his countenance. The men who had come with him arose, and, bowing with far more respect than when they entered, withdrew, and Rowley went with them. There was a change in the pious merchant after this. He conducted his business with less apparent eagerness to get the best of every bargain than had been his custom in former times, but whether influenced by more genuine Christian principles or by an awakened love of reputation, it is not for us to say. It is not by a man's religious profession that the world judges of his character, but by the quality of his transactions in business intercourse with his fellow men. If he be truly religious, it will be seen here in the justice and judgment of all his business transactions. If a man be not faithful to his brother, he cannot be faithful to heaven. End of The Sunday Christian. I knew how it would be. "He'll never succeed," was the remark of Mr. Houston, on reference being made to a young man named Eldridge, who had recently commenced business. "Why not?" was asked. "He's begun wrong." "In what way?" "His connection is bad." "With Dalton?" "Yes, Dalton is either knave or a fool. The former, I believe, but in either case the result will be the same to his partner. Before 2 years, unless a miracle takes place, you will see Eldridge, at least, coming out at the little end of the horn. I could have told him this at first, but it was none of my business. I never meddle with things that don't concern me." "You know Dalton, then?" "I think I do." "Has he been in business before?" "Yes, 6 times, and somehow or other he has always managed to get out of it, with cash in hand, long before it broke down to escape all odium and responsibility." "I'm sorry for Eldridge. He is a clever young man, and honest into the bargain." "Yes, and he has energy of character and some business talents, but he is too confiding, and here is just the weakness that will prove his ruin. He will put too much faith in his plausible associate. Someone should warn him of this danger. Were I intimate enough to venture on the freedom, I would certainly do so. I don't meddle myself with other people's affairs. One never gets any thanks for the trouble he takes on this score. At least, that is my experience, and, moreover, it's about as much as I can do to take good care of my own concerns. This is every man's business. I wish you had given the young man a word of caution before he was involved with Dalton." "I did think of doing so, but then I reflected that it was his lookout and not mine. Each man has to cut his eye-teeth for himself, you know." "True, but when we see a stumbling block in the way of a blind man, or one whose eyes are turned in another direction, we ought at least to utter a warning word. It seems to me that we owe that much goodwill to our fellows." "Perhaps we do, and I don't know that it would have been any harm if I had done as you suggest. However, it is too late now." "I think not. A hint of truth would put him on his guard." "I don't know." "Oh, yes, it would." "I am not certain. Dalton is a most plausible man, and I am pretty sure that, in the mind of a person like Eldridge, he can inspire the fullest confidence. To suggest anything wrong now would not put him on his guard, and might lead the suggester into trouble." Much more was said on both sides, but no good result flowed from the conversation. Mr. Houston did not hesitate to declare that he knew how it would all be in the end, but at the same time said that it was none of his business, and that every man must look out for himself. The character of Dalton was by no means harshly judged by Mr. Houston. He was, at heart, a knave, yet a most cunning and specious one. Eldridge, on the contrary, was the very soul of integrity, and, being thoroughly honest in all his intentions, it was hard for him to believe that any man who spoke fair to him and professed to be governed by right principles could be a scoundrel. With a few $1,000s, his share of his father's estate, he had come to Boston for the purpose of commencing some kind of business. With creditable prudence, he entered the store of a merchant and remained there for a year in order to obtain a practical familiarity with trade. During this period he fell in with Dalton, who was in a small commission way that barely yielded him enough to meet his expenses. Dalton was not in long discovering that Eldridge had some cash, and that his ultimate intention was to engage in business for himself. From that time he evinced towards the young man a very friendly spirit, and soon found a good reason for changing his boarding place and making his home under the same roof with Eldridge. To win upon the young man's confidence was no hard matter. Before 6 months, Dalton was looked upon as a generous-minded friend who had his interests deeply at heart. All his views in regard to business were freely communicated, and he rested upon the suggestions of Dalton with the confidence of one who believed that he had met a friend not only fully competent to advise aright, but thoroughly unselfish in all his feelings. Dalton possessed a large amount of business information, and was, therefore, the very man for Eldridge, particularly as he was communicative. In conversation, the latter obtained a great deal of information on subjects especially interesting to one who looked forward to engaging in some branch of trade for himself. One evening the two men sat conversing about business, as usual, when Eldridge said, "It is time that I was making some move for myself, but for my life I can't come to any decision as to what I shall do." "It is better for a young man, if he can do so, to connect himself with some established house," replied Dalton to this. "It takes time to make a new business, and not unfrequently a very long time." "I am aware of that, but I see no opportunity for an arrangement of the kind." "How much capital can you furnish?" $10,000. "That's very good, and ought to enable you to make an arrangement somewhere. I don't know, but I might be willing to give you an interest in my business. This, however, would require some reflection. I am turning out a very handsome surplus every year, without at all crowding sale." "A commission business?" "Yes. I am agent for 3 or 4 manufactories, and effect some pretty large sales during the year. If I were able to make liberal cash advances, I could more than quadruple my business." "And, of course, your profits also?" "Yes, that follows as a natural result." "Would $10,000 be at all adequate for such a purpose?" "It would help very much. $10,000 in cash is, you know, a basis of credit to nearly 4 times that sum." "Yes, I am aware of that." "Is your capital readily available?" inquired Dalton. "Yes. Since I have been in the city, I have invested everything in government securities, as safe property and readily convertible into cash." "Very judicious." Dalton mused for some time. "Yes," he at length said, as if he had been thinking seriously of the effect of $10,000 in his business, "the capital you have would put a new face on everything. That's certain. Suppose you think the matter over, and I will do the same." "I will, certainly. And may I say now that there will hardly be any hindrance on my part to the arrangement, if you should see it to be advantageous all around." Of course, Mr. Dalton professed, after taking a decent time for pretended reflection, to see great advantage to all parties in a business connection which in due time was formed. But few of those who knew Eldridge were apprised of what he intended doing, and those who did know, and were aware at the same time of Mr. Dalton's character, like Mr. Houston, concluded to mind their own business. And so, unwarned of the risk he was encountering, an honest and confiding young man was permitted to form a co-partnership with a villain, who had already been the means of involving 3 or 4 unsuspecting individuals in hopeless embarrassment. Confident that he had entered the road to fortune, Eldridge commenced his new career. The capital he had supplied gave, as Dalton predicted, new life to the business, for the offer of liberal cash advances brought heavier consignments and opened the way for more extensive operations. The general management of affairs was left, according to previous understanding, in the hands of the senior partner, as most competent for that department, while Eldridge gave his mind to the practical details of the business, which by the end of a year had grown far beyond his anticipations. Accepting large consignments of goods upon which advances had been made required the raising of a great deal of money, and this Dalton managed to accomplish without calling away the attention of his partner from what he was engaged in doing. Thus matters went on for about 3 years, when Dalton began to complain of failing health and to hint that he would be compelled to retire from active business. Eldridge said that he must not think of this, but the senior partner did think of it very seriously. From that time his health appeared to break rapidly, and in a few months he formally announced his intention to withdraw. Finding both remonstrance and persuasion of no avail, the basis of a dissolution of the co-partnership was agreed upon, in which the value of the business itself, that would now be entirely in the hands of Eldridge, was rated high as an offset to a pretty large sum which Dalton claimed as his share in the concern. Without due reflection, there being a balance of $5,000 to the credit of the firm in bank, which, by the way, was provided for special effect at the time by the cunning senior, Eldridge consented that, for his share of the business, Dalton should be permitted to take bills receivable, amounting to $6,000, a check for $2,000, and his notes for $10,000 besides, payable in 3 to 18 months. After all this was settled, a dissolution of the co-partnership was publicly announced, and Eldridge, with some misgivings at heart, undertook the entire management of the business himself. It was but a very little while before he found himself embarrassed in making his payments. The withdrawal of $2,000 in cash and $6,000 in paper convertible into cash created a serious disability. In fact, an earnest and thorough investigation of the whole business showed it to be so crippled that little less than a miracle would enable him to conduct it to a safe issue. Nevertheless, still unsuspicious to the real truth, he resolved to struggle manfully for a triumph over the difficulties that lay before him, and overcome them, if there was any virtue in energy and perseverance. The first point at which the business suffered was in the loss of consignments. Inability to make the required advances turned from the warehouse of Eldridge large lots of goods almost weekly, the profits on the sales of which would have been a handsome addition to his income. At the end of 3 months, the first note of $1,000 held by Dalton fell due, and was paid. This was so much more taken from his capital. Another month brought a payment of a like amount, and at the end of 6 months $1,000 more were paid. Thus Dalton had been able to get $11,000 out of the concern, although 3 years before he was not really worth a dollar, and there were still due him $7,000. By this time the eyes of Eldridge were beginning to open to the truth. Suspicion being once finally awakened, he entered upon a careful examination of the business from the time of forming the co-partnership. This occupied him for some weeks before he was able to bring out a clear and comprehensive exhibit of affairs. Then he saw that he had been the victim of a specious and cunning scoundrel, and that, so far from being worth a dollar, he had obligations falling due for over $10,000 more than he had means to pay. A sad and disheartening result. And what added to the pain of Eldridge was the fact that he should have been so weak and short-sighted as to permit himself to be thus duped and cheated. "I knew how it would be," said Mr. Houston coolly, when he was told that Eldridge was in difficulties. "Nothing else was to have been expected." "Why so?" inquired the person to whom the remark was made. "Everybody knows Dalton to be a sharper." Eldridge is not his first victim. I did not know it. I did then, and prophesied just this result. You? Yes, certainly I did. I knew exactly how it must turn out. And here's the end, as I predicted." This was said with great self-complacency. Soon after the conversation, a young man named Williams, who had only a year before married the daughter of Mr. Houston, came into his store with a look of trouble on his countenance. His business was that of an exchange broker, and in conducting it he was using the credit of his father-in-law quite liberally. "What's the matter?" inquired Mr. Houston, seeing by the expression of the young man's face that something was wrong. "Have you heard anything about Eldridge?" inquired Williams in an anxious voice. "Yes, I understand that he is about making a failure of it, and, if so, it will be a bad one. But what has that to do with your affairs?" "If he fails, I am ruined," replied the young man, becoming greatly excited. "You?" It was now Mr. Houston's turn to exhibit a disturbed aspect. "I hold $7,000 of his paper." $7,000? "Yes." "How in the name of wonder did it come into your possession?" "I took it from Dalton at a tempting discount." "From Dalton? Then his name is on the paper?" "No, I hold it without recourse." "What folly! How could you have done such a thing?" "I believed Eldridge to be perfectly good. Dalton said he was in the way of making a fortune." "Why, then, was he anxious to part with his paper without recourse?" "It was, he alleged, on account of ill health. He wished to close up all his business and make an investment of what little he possessed previous to going south, in the hope that a change of air would brace up his shattered constitution. It was all a lie, the scoundrel! His health is as good as mine. A greater villain than he is does not walk the earth. I wonder how you could have been so duped." "How do you think Eldridge's affairs will turn out?" asked the young man. "Worse than nothing, I suppose. I understand that he paid Dalton some $18,000 for his half of the business. There was but $10,000 capital at first, and from the way things were conducted, instead of its increasing, it must have diminished yearly." Here was an entirely new aspect in the case. Mr. Houston's self-complacency was gone. He knew how it would be with Eldridge from the first, but he didn't know how it was going to be with himself. He didn't for a moment dream that when the fabric of the young man's fortune came falling around him, that anything belonging to him would be buried under the ruins. "Too bad, too bad," he ejaculated as, under a sense of the utter desperation of the case, he struck his hands together, and then threw them above his head. But it did no good to fret and scold and blame his son-in-law. The error had been committed, and it was now too late to retrace a step. $6,000 or $7,000 would inevitably be lost, and as Williams had no capital originally of his own, the money would have to come out of his pocket. The ruin of which the young man talked was more in his imagination than anywhere else, as Mr. Houston was able enough to sustain him in his difficulty. In the winding up of the affairs of Eldridge, who stopped payment on the day Williams announced to his father-in-law the fact that he held his notes, everything turned out as badly as Mr. Houston had predicted. The unhappy young man was almost beside himself with trouble, mortification, and disappointment. Not only had he lost everything he possessed in the world, he was deeply involved in debt besides, and his good name was gone. A marriage contract, into which he had entered, was broken off in consequence, the father of the lady demanding of him a release of the engagement in a way so insulting that the young man flung insult back into his teeth and never after went near his house. For months after the disastrous termination of his business, Eldridge lingered about the city in a miserable state of mind. Some friends obtained for him a situation as clerk, but he did not keep the place very long. It seemed almost impossible for him to fix his attention upon anything. This neglect of the interests of his employer was so apparent that he was dismissed from his place at the end of a few months. This increased the morbid despondency under which he was laboring, and led to an almost total abandonment of himself. In less than a year he was traveling swiftly along the road to utter ruin. One day, it was just 12 months from the time of Eldridge's failure, Mr. Houston stood conversing with a gentleman, when the unhappy young man went reeling by, so much intoxicated that he with difficulty kept his feet. "Poor fellow," said the gentleman, in a tone of pity, "he was badly dealt by." "There is no doubt of that," returned Mr. Houston. "Dalton managed his cards with his usual skill. But I knew how it would be from the first. I knew that Dalton was a knave at heart and would overreach him." "You did?" was rejoined with a look of tone and surprise. "Oh yes, I predicted from the beginning the very result that has come out." "You warned the young man, of course?" inquired the gentleman. "No." "What? Saw him in the hands of a sharper and gave him no warning? I never meddle in other people's affairs. I find as much as I can do to take proper care of my own. And yet, if common report is true, had you taken a little care of this young man, you would have saved $6,000 or $7,000 for yourself." "That's my outlook," said Mr. Houston. "You knew how it would be," resumed the gentleman in a severe, rebuking voice, "and yet kept silence, permitting an honest, confiding young man to fall into the clutches of a scoundrel. Mr. Houston, society holds you responsible for the ruin of one of its members, equally responsible with the knave who was the agent of the ruin. A word would have saved the young man, but in your indifference and disregard of others' good, you would not speak that word. When next you see the miserable wreck of a human being that but just now went staggering past, remember the work of your own hands is before you." And saying this, the man turned abruptly away, leaving Mr. Houston so much astonished and bewildered by the unexpected charge, as scarcely to comprehend where he was. Recovering himself in a moment or two, he walked slowly along, his eyes upon the ground, with what feelings the reader may imagine. A few days afterwards, his son-in-law, at his instance, went in search of Eldridge for the purpose of offering him assistance, and making an effort to reclaim him. But, alas, he was too late. Death had finished the work of ruin. End of I Knew How It Would Be. Stay tuned for part 2 of 4. In Words for the Wise by T.S. Arthur.